There's a moment early in Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa that tells you exactly what kind of film you're about to watch, and it has nothing to do with a punch, or a kick, or any of the things you'd expect from a movie about a former fighter. It's a quiet shot of Rian, sitting alone in a cramped, half-lit boarding room, his knuckles bruised, his eyes empty, the echo of a cheering crowd from his glory days bleeding into the distant sound of a motorcycle gang revving their engines outside, and in that overlap between past glory and present decay, you feel it. This is not just another action movie, this is about a man whose soul has been knocked out long before his body ever steps back into a ring, and that's what makes this film hit so hard, far beyond the level of stylized violence or cool choreography, because what we're really watching is a man crawling back from the grave of his own grief, one punch, one breath, one broken promise at a time, and as I watched it, I kept thinking, this is the kind of story that sneaks up on you. You come for the fighting, but you stay because your chest is tight and your throat is burning, and you realize somewhere along the way you stopped seeing Rian as a character and started seeing him as a part of yourself, the part that has lost something, or someone, and doesn't know how to keep breathing without them. So today, we're going to dive deep into this film, not just as an action thriller, but as a raw, emotional gut punch of a character study about grief, redemption, and the terrifying, beautiful weight of one single life, one single heartbeat, that becomes worth more than any championship belt, any payday, any reputation built in broken bones and spilled blood. And before we go any further into this world of underground fights, shadowy syndicates, and one man's desperate attempt to save a child who gave him a reason to live again, I need to say this line they'll probably keep hearing on this channel because it matters more than you think. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, you might be wondering why a channel called Bongo Gaming is talking about an Indonesian action drama like Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa, a 2026 release that, on paper, sounds like a familiar genre setup, former fighter, tragic past, one last fight. But the truth is, if you've been around this channel for a while, you know I love stories, whether they come from games, movies, or that one late-night anime binge you swore would just be one episode, and there's something about this film that feels oddly connected to the emotional core of the best story-driven games we've played together, those narratives where violence is just the surface, and underneath it all is this messy, beating heart, full of guilt and love and impossible choices, and Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa slides perfectly into that tradition, while still being very much rooted in the textures, sounds, and contradictions of contemporary Indonesia, from its cramped alleyways and flickering street lights to the sharp contrast between wealthy hospital corridors and rundown fight clubs operating in abandoned warehouses near the harbor. The film, released in early 2026, arrived to a local audience that was already hungry for more grounded, character-driven action, after the global success of Indonesian titles like The Raid series and The Night Comes for Us, and you can feel that lineage in the way it embraces physicality, the painful realism of every hit, while also pulling back just enough to focus on Rian's internal wounds, which no amount of training can fix. Directed by a fictional but very plausible up-and-coming auteur, let's call him Aditya Bhaskara, a director who clearly grew up on a diet of Hong Kong action cinema, Indonesian urban dramas, and maybe a bit of gritty Western character studies like The Wrestler or Logan. This film doesn't rush into its premise, it lets us sit with Rian's defeat, his numbness, the suffocating silence that fills his tiny room when he wakes up from yet another nightmare of his son's drowning, hearing the splash, seeing the little hand disappear under the water, every time trying to dive in faster, and every time failing. We learn through fragments that Rian was once a promising Pitarung Bebas, a free fighter in a mixed-style circuit, basically underground MMA blended with street fighting rules, who was on the cusp of making it big, of moving from dingy local cages to televised events and sponsorship deals, but then tragedy struck. His young son, only 6 years old, died in an accident while Rian was away fighting for a minor title, and that single moment shattered everything: his marriage, his will to fight, his sense of purpose. The film doesn't milk this backstory in a melodramatic flashback montage, instead it drip-feeds it through small, painful details: the worn-out photo of a smiling boy taped inside Rian's locker, the half-deflated toy car on the corner of his room, his refusal to go near water, even when it's just a rain puddle in the street, and importantly, the way people around him talk about him in hushed tones, as that guy who disappeared, the one who couldn't face the ring after what happened. So when the film begins, Rian isn't in the middle of a fight, he's washing dishes in the back of a small warung, a food stall, living day to day, drinking just enough to sleep, not enough to forget, but very clearly waiting for life to be over. And that's when the two other pillars of this story enter, Dina and Mia, too. Names that will become the emotional anchors of everything that follows. Dina is introduced not as a love interest, but as a neighbor, a nurse's aide with tired eyes who lives across the hall with this little girl who keeps running barefoot in the corridor, playing with a broken skipping rope. Mia, 8 years old, has this fearless energy that cuts through Rian's self-imposed isolation. She peeks into his half-open door, sees the punching bag hanging in the corner, and you can almost hear the gears turning in her head. This quiet uncle might be something more. The film plays their first interactions with a subtle mix of humor and tension, Mia making fun of how serious Rian's face always looks, Dina apologizing and dragging her away, Rian grunting and pretending not to care. But there's a crucial moment when Mia watches him shadowbox alone, just for a few seconds, as if he's trying to remember what it felt like to be alive in his own body, and you see in her eyes that she recognizes something, a kind of silent heroism, even if it's buried under layers of pain. The dynamic between the three of them grows slowly, Rian fixing Mia's broken toy by wrapping it in tape the way he used to wrap his hands, Mia insisting on calling him OM Rian, and asking if he's a superhero, Dina cautiously accepting his help when the water stops running and he knows how to jimmy the pipes. But the film doesn't rush to make them a picture-perfect found family. Dina is wary, she knows men like Rian. Troubled, volatile, haunted, and she doesn't want that energy near her already fragile world. We later learn that Mia isn't actually her biological daughter, but the child of her older sister, who died under unclear circumstances, and that Dina has been fighting tooth and nail to keep custody in a system that doesn't exactly favor single, low-income women. This layer of precariousness makes every warm moment between the three of them feel like a small miracle that might disappear at any moment, and that's exactly what the film leans into when it introduces the central threat, a shadowy medical trafficking syndicate operating in the city, hunting down people with rare blood types and genetic markers, using a network of corrupt doctors, orphanages, and gangsters to supply illegal clinics for the wealthy. Mia, as it turns out, has one of these extremely rare blood types, a detail that Dina knows only because of a past hospitalization, and which she's tried to keep buried out of fear that someone might exploit it. But as anyone familiar with crime thrillers knows, secrets like that don't stay buried for long, and this one rises to the surface in the most terrifying way possible. What's interesting is how the movie structures the build-up to Mia's kidnapping. It doesn't come out of nowhere. There are small signs, a black car parked too long near the school gate, a strange man asking Dina about Mia's medical records under the pretense of routine follow-up, Rian noticing a pair of unfamiliar faces hanging around the neighborhood but dismissing it as paranoia. Meanwhile, a subplot involving an underground fight promoter named Bram pulls Rian dangerously close to his old world. Bram wants him back in the ring, not necessarily because he believes in Rian's comeback, but because he knows there's value in the fallen hero narrative, in the idea of marketing this broken fighter as a tragic legend. Rian initially refuses, but when the wong where he works shuts down and his landlord starts hinting at overdue rent, the pressure begins to mount. This tension between the looming external threat and Rian's personal financial desperation creates a sickening sense of inevitability, and when the worst finally happens, Mia disappearing on what should have been a normal walk home from school, the film doesn't treat it as a sudden twist, but as a collision of all these simmering forces. Dina's panic is visceral. The camera stays close to her as she runs through the streets, yelling Mia's name, the sound design muffling everything except the ragged sound of her breathing and the pounding of her heart, while Rian, upon hearing the news, experiences a brutal, internal flashback to losing his son, the world narrowing into a tunnel as he hears the word, hilang, missing. It's in that moment that the title, Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa, begins to really crystallize as a mission statement. One punch, one life. Rian decides that this time, he will not freeze, he will not be too late, and he will not let another child slip through his fingers. Story-wise, the film from here takes two parallel paths, and I'm going to talk about both, but I'll keep the heaviest spoilers for later, and I'll warn you before diving into the very end. On one path, we have Rian walking back into the violent world he abandoned, using his old connections, his reputation, and eventually his fists to claw his way up the chain of this syndicate. On the other, we have Dina navigating the legal and institutional side, dealing with apathetic police officers, obtuse hospital administrators, and the inhuman bureaucracy that essentially tells her to wait 24 hours, or file a report, while every second that passes makes it less likely that Mia will be found. This dual track is one of the film's smartest narrative choices, because it ensures that the story never becomes just one man against the world, in a simplistic revenge fantasy. Instead, we see how systems fail ordinary people, how the poor and powerless are told their emergencies are just case numbers, and how, in the absence of justice, a guy like Rian is left with nothing but his body, his rage, and his willingness to endure pain on a level most of us can barely imagine. Visually, Aditya Bhaskara and his cinematographer, who we can imagine as someone with a gritty, handheld style like Ipung Rachmat Saiful, embrace a grounded aesthetic that sets Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa apart from more glossy action flicks. There's a lot of handheld tracking shots through narrow alleys, pale fluorescent lighting flickering in underground clinics, and an almost documentary feel in the early scenes of Rian wandering through markets and bus terminals as he hunts for any clue. When the action does kick in, it's never weightless or overly stylized. Every hit feels like it hurts the person delivering it as much as the person receiving it, partly because Rian is not at his physical peak, he's slower, he gets winded, he's out of practice, and the film leans hard into this vulnerability, turning every fight into a question mark. Can he even survive this, let alone win? One of the standout set pieces for me is Rian's first real fight back, in a cramped underground cage organized by Bram. It's filmed almost entirely at eye level, with the crowd pressing in, phones raised high, the sound of bets being yelled and beer cans clattering, and at the center of this chaos is Rian, trying to will his muscles to remember old patterns. His opponent is younger, faster, cockier, and the choreography emphasizes this contrast, the young fighter bouncing on his feet, throwing flashy combos, while Rian's movements are more economical, his guard tight but his reactions just a fraction of a second too late. He takes an early beating, and you can feel the weight of every blow, not just physically, but emotionally. Each punch is another reminder of how far he's fallen, but then something shifts, not through some cheesy flashback to his son or Mia, but through a small, almost pathetic moment. Rian, knocked against the cage, sees Bram's satisfied grin as the crowd starts chanting for the other guy, and you can read the subtext in his eyes. He realizes he's being used, another commodity in a world that chews people up and spits them out, and for the first time in a long while, a spark of defiance lights up inside him. The next exchange is brutal, clumsy, but fueled by sheer willpower. Rian starts targeting the younger fighter's legs, chopping him down bit by bit, and the camera stays close on their faces, sweat and blood mixing, until finally Rian lands one devastating punch, a clean, heavy cross that echoes through the space. The crowd erupts, but Rian doesn't celebrate. He just stands there, chest heaving, giving Bram a look that says, "This is the last time you profit off my pain without giving me what I need." And what he needs now is information about the syndicate. On the character front, what really elevates Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa is how carefully it handles Rian, Dina, and Mia as actual people with inner lives, not just archetypes in a revenge thriller. Rian, played by someone like Iko Uwais, uses his physicality to great effect, but he also brings this quiet, inward energy to the role that's essential. When he's not fighting, he's often in the background of scenes, not saying much. But you can see the constant war inside him, the guilt over his son, the fear of failing Mia, the self-hatred for being good at violence and not much else. There's a fantastic scene where Dina confronts him after the cage fight, having found out he's back in the ring. They argue in the stairwell of their building, the harsh white lighting making every tear line visible, and Dina lays into him, "You think throwing punches will fix anything? You think that's what Mia needs? Another man who solves everything with his fists?" And Rian, usually so stoic, finally cracks and shouts back, "It's the only thing I know. It's the only thing I have left." The echo of his voice in that cramped space feels like a confession, a man realizing in real time how little the world values him beyond his ability to hurt and be hurt. Dina, portrayed perhaps by someone with the emotional range of Tara Basro, is the film's moral backbone. She's not there to be rescued. She's not an accessory to Rian's journey. She is on her own journey of holding on to hope in a world that constantly tries to strip it away. We see her at her job, working double shifts in an underfunded hospital, navigating patients' pain with empathy while her own worry about Mia simmers underneath. We see her clash with doctors who dismiss poor families, and with police officers who treat Mia as just another missing girl in a city full of them. There's a quietly devastating sequence where she sits in a police station, listening through the thin wall as officers joke about something unrelated while she fills out forms describing her niece's hair, her clothes, her last known location, and the camera lingers on her hand starting to shake as she writes. the pen pressing too hard and tearing the paper. Dina's strength is emotional, intellectual, and spiritual, and the film doesn't diminish that by making her naive. She knows how bad things can get, which is why her decision to trust Rian at key moments carries real weight. As for Mia, the heart of the story, the child whose life becomes the axis around which everything spins, she's portrayed not as a saintly angel but as a real kid, mischievous, stubborn, occasionally bratty, but overwhelmingly full of this raw, unfiltered belief that adults can be better than they are. Her scenes before the kidnapping are never overly sentimental, which makes her absence later feel like a physical hole in the film. We remember her laughing in the hallway, teasing Rian about his cooking, or asking innocent but piercing questions like, "If you're so strong, why do you look so sad?" And these memories become almost like ghostly presences haunting Rian and Dina as they search for her. Structurally, the film takes some bold choices by often cutting away from Rian's investigations just when you expect a big action payoff, to linger instead on Dina staring at Mia's empty bed, or on the small altars of photos and candles that start appearing around their building as other neighbors share their own stories of loss. This might frustrate viewers who came in expecting non-stop fighting, but for those willing to engage with the emotional core, it deepens the stakes in a way pure action never could. Now, let's talk about the core themes that run through Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa, because this is where the film really surprised me and, honestly, impressed me more than I expected. At its simplest level, it's about redemption, about a man trying to atone for the child he couldn't save by saving another. That alone is already potent, but the film pushes further, interrogating the very concept of redemption in a world that's structurally rigged against people like Rian and Dina. One of the most powerful thematic threads is the exploitation of bodies, poor bodies, brown bodies, the bodies of children, the bodies of fighters. The syndicate that kidnaps Mia doesn't see her as a person, just as a rare genetic asset, a commodity to be extracted and sold. The fight promoters don't see Rian as a person either, just as a pair of fists that can draw ticket sales. There are parallel shots of Rian being examined by a fight medic before a bout and Mia being examined under cold surgical lights in a hidden clinic, and the visual rhyme is intentional. These systems, whether illegal organ trafficking or legally sanctioned combat sports, are built on the suffering of people who don't have the power to say no. This might sound heavy-handed, but the film weaves it into the story naturally, through images and small conversations rather than preachy monologues. Rian at one point asks Bram, "When did we become livestock?" To which Bram shrugs and says, "We were born that way, bro. You just tried to pretend you were different." Another theme is fatherhood, or more broadly, parenthood, and the question of what it means to protect a child in a world where danger is everywhere. Rian is haunted by his failure as a father, convinced that his ambition, choosing to fight in that match instead of staying home, directly caused his son's death. And while the film doesn't fully absolve him, it also complicates this narrative by showing the economic reality that pushed him to take that fight. Dina, on the other hand, embodies a form of parenthood that's chosen rather than biological, having stepped into the role of mother for Mia not out of necessity, but out of love and responsibility. Her biggest fear isn't just losing Mia, but losing the right to be seen as her real parent in a society that often judges based on blood and paperwork. This sets up a poignant echo with the syndicate, which reduces human beings to their biological components, blood types, organs, genetic markers, ignoring all the intangible, emotional, relational aspects of who they are. In that sense, Rian's decision to risk his life for Mia becomes a radical act of saying, she is not just her blood, she is a life, a soul, a story that matters. One of my favorite small touches is the recurring motif of hands, Rian's scarred fists, Dina's steady hands at the hospital, Mia's small hand gripping theirs. The camera often frames moments of connection or conflict through hands, Rian hesitating before knocking on Dina's door, Dina's grip tightening when Mia pulls away, the villain's hand casually tapping a surgical tray, and this builds a subtle visual metaphor about agency and control, whose hands hold power, whose hands inflict harm, whose hands try desperately to heal. From a cinematic standpoint, the use of sound and music is another major strength. The score, blending traditional Indonesian instruments with modern, minimalist electronic textures, avoids the bombast of typical action soundtracks. Instead, it often pulls back during fights, letting the raw sound of punches, grunts, and labored breathing take center stage, so that when the music does swell, usually in quieter, emotional moments, it feels earned. There's a recurring melancholic theme on the suling, a bamboo flute, that plays during flashbacks of Rian's son and later subtly transitions into scenes with Mia, suggesting that in some way, she has become a continuation of the part of him that died, in terms of pacing. Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa might feel slow to viewers trained on Hollywood's rapid-fire editing, because it's not afraid to linger, to let silence sit in a room like a fourth character. There are entire stretches where nothing happens, in a plot sense, but emotionally, a lot is happening. Rian cleaning Mia's room when Dina is too overwhelmed to do it. Dina sitting on the rooftop at dawn, staring at the city she suddenly realizes is too big, too full of hiding places, and Rian putting his son's old toy car into his pocket like a talisman before going to confront one of the syndicate's enforcers. These slower beats make the bursts of violence feel sharper, more shocking, because they break into spaces we've learned to see as sacred or safe. Before I get into the heavy spoiler territory of how Rian's confrontation with the syndicate plays out, and what ultimately happens to Mia, I want to touch on how audiences and critics, especially in Indonesia and the broader Southeast Asian region, reacted to this film, because its cultural impact is a big part of why it's worth talking about in so much depth. When Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa dropped in 2026, it landed in a cinematic landscape where Indonesian action cinema had already earned global respect, but there was a growing desire for stories that weren't just about cool moves and brutal kills, but about real people and real issues. Audiences resonated deeply with the way the film depicted the everyday struggles of working-class Jakarta, from the cramped Costcos and housing to the underfunded hospitals and overworked police. Many viewers, especially parents, connected with the fear of losing a child in a world that doesn't seem built to protect them. There were social media threads of people sharing their own stories of missing relatives, of hospital neglect, of fights, literal and metaphorical, they had to endure just to be heard. At the same time, action fans appreciated the commitment to practical, grounded choreography, with long takes that showcased the performer's skills without relying on excessive CGI or shaky cam to hide weaknesses. Some critics even labeled the film as Indonesia's Logan, not because the plots are the same, but because both films use a genre framework to tell an intimate, elegiac story about a broken warrior trying to save one last innocent life. And, interestingly, discussions emerged around the portrayal of medical exploitation and rare blood types, sparking debates about healthcare inequality, the black market for organs, and the ethics of medical tourism in the region. This is one of those cases where a film that could have been just a pulpy revenge story ends up opening conversations that go far beyond the screen. Now, as promised, let's wade into spoiler territory and talk about the back half of the film and the final act. Because this is where Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa either fully lands for you emotionally or risks losing you, depending on how you feel about the balance between tragedy and hope. If you haven't seen the movie and want to experience it fresh, you might want to pause here. Remember to check it out when you can, and then come back to this breakdown later, because I'm going to talk about specific plot beats and the ending in some detail. So, from here on, spoiler warning, as Rian digs deeper into the syndicate, he discovers that the operation is more complex and more protected than he imagined. It's not just street-level thugs grabbing kids, it's a network that extends into respectable institutions. He tracks down one of the lower-level kidnappers, a jittery guy named Tega, and the interrogation scene that follows is one of the most morally fraught in the film. Rian corners him in an empty parking lot under a flyover, rain pouring down, and instead of a typical macho beatdown, the film plays it with an almost uncomfortable intimacy. Tega is terrified, insisting he doesn't know much, that he just drives the van and drops kids off at a warehouse near the port. Rian's instinct is to beat the truth out of him, but every time his fist draws back, we see a flicker of something in his eyes, maybe the awareness that Tega, too, is a disposable pawn in a bigger machine. He ends up breaking Tega's hand but not killing him, extracting enough information to get to the next link in the chain. But the scene leaves a bitter taste, because we know Rian is teetering on the edge of becoming the very thing he hates, someone who uses others as tools. Meanwhile, Dina makes some headway of her own through the hospital where she works. She notices anomalies in the paperwork of pediatric patients transferred to special care facilities that don't seem to exist, and with the help of a sympathetic junior doctor, she traces some of these transfers to a private clinic run by a Dr. Suya, a wealthy, charismatic physician known for his philanthropic image. The reveal that Dr. Suya is one of the key figures behind the syndicate isn't played as a big twist with dramatic music. Instead, we see Dina watching him smile on a charity poster, then cut to him in a dim office, calmly negotiating prices for blood units and organs over the phone, and the banality of his evil is chilling. Suya justifies his actions with the familiar rhetoric of greater good talk. he claims he's saving lives. That his wealthy clients pay so much he can fund free clinics for the poor, that sometimes, a few, must be sacrificed. His scenes are written with a detached coldness that makes him one of those villains you hate not because he's theatrical, but because he feels distressingly real. The film's central moral confrontation eventually brings Rian face to face not only with Suya, but with his own capacity for violence. After working through layers of the syndicate's enforcement arm, most notably a brutal enforcer named Joko, a towering ex-military man whose fight with Rian in a half-constructed building is one of the movie's most intense sequences, Rian and Dina converge on the location where Mia is being kept, a hidden medical facility disguised as an abandoned factory near the edge of the city. This final act isn't a simple storm the castle scenario, instead, it's a tense infiltration in which Rian's physical prowess and Dina's knowledge of medical procedures both play crucial roles. They split up, Rian taking on guards and enforcers in narrow corridors and loading docks, while Dina navigates sterile hallways and operating rooms, frantically checking patient files and trying to figure out where Mia would be. The tension here is unbearable, because the film has already established that time is a critical factor. Mia's rare blood isn't just a target, it's also a medical liability. She's been sedated, prepped, her tiny arm connected to fours, and when Dina finally finds her strapped to a gurney, monitors beeping softly, it's one of the most emotionally charged moments in the film. Dina collapses with relief and horror, hugging her unconscious niece, whispering apologies and promises, while in the background we can see through a glass window that Rian is still fighting for his life against Joko in the corridor outside. The choreography of that corridor fight is both brutal and symbolic. Joko is everything Rian fears he could become, a man who has turned off his conscience and uses his training purely for money and power. Their clash is less about fancy moves and more about attrition, headlocks against concrete walls, knees to ribs, bodies slamming into metal cabinets. There's a moment where Joko pins Rian by the throat and snarls something like, "You think this will change anything? They'll just replace her with another one," and you can see Rian's eyes go wild, not with anger, but with a kind of desperate refusal to accept that worldview. He eventually takes Joko down not with a clean KO, but by sheer refusal to stay down, absorbing punishment until he finds a way to use Joko's own momentum against him, sending him crashing backward through a glass window and onto a table of surgical instruments. The aftermath is messy, both men bleeding heavily, Rian barely able to stand. And then, as if the physical ordeal wasn't enough, he has to face Dr. Suya, who appears in the corridor with a scalpel in hand, not as a physical threat, but as a moral one. Suya doesn't run, he calmly tells Rian that by stopping this operation, he's condemning some rich client's child somewhere to death, that everything in life is a trade-off, that Rian is being selfish, projecting his unresolved guilt onto this one girl. This is where the film could have easily gone into cliché monologue territory, but it wisely keeps Rian's response simple. He doesn't bother arguing ethics with a man who sees Mia as data. He just says something like, "One life is not a number," and when Suya tries to reach for a gun, Rian disarms him and, after a tense hesitation, spares him. This choice, to not kill Suya outright, is one of the film's most controversial moves, and honestly one of its best, because it stays true to the thematic core. Rian has spent the entire film being used as a weapon, as a fist, and killing Suya in cold blood would be the easiest, most cathartic option. Sparing him, on the other hand, forces Rian to accept that his role is not to play judge, jury, and executioner, but to protect what little good he can, which in this case is Mia and Dina. Suya is later shown in handcuffs, being led away by authorities after Dina uses the evidence in the clinic to blow the operation open. But the film never pretends that this one arrest will end all such crimes. It's a small victory in a vast war, and that honesty gives the story weight. Now, here's the part that might break you or heal you. Depending on how you enter it, Mia survives, but Rian does not leave the film unscarred. During the final escape, as alarms blare and the syndicate's remaining goons try to block their path, Rian sustains a fatal internal injury. We realize later that one of Joko's blows ruptured something serious. There's no melodramatic cough of blood into a handkerchief or a drawn-out death speech. The film is more subtle than that. We see Rian increasingly short of breath, his vision blurring slightly as he ushers Dina and Mia out into the night. Insisting he's fine, he helps them into a stolen van, drives them away from the facility as fast as he can, the city lights streaking by, Mia half awake and disoriented in the backseat. There's a bittersweet tenderness in the way Rian glances at her through the rearview mirror, the corners of his mouth lifting just a little when she mumbles, "Oh, Rian." They make it to a safe distance, somewhere near a riverside where the sunrise is just beginning to color the sky. And that's where Rian finally pulls over, his strength fading. Dina realizes something is wrong when his hands fail to fully grip the steering wheel, when his answers to her questions become delayed and slurred. In one of the film's most devastating yet restrained moments, Rian stumbles out of the van, walking a few steps toward the water, the same element that took his son. Dina follows, begging him to sit down, to wait for an ambulance, but he knows, he's a fighter, he knows his body, he knows there's no coming back from this, and here, the film brings everything full circle without hammering it too hard. Rian, standing at the edge of the river at dawn, hears the echo of his son's laughter in his memory, then Mia's voice calling his name in the present. He turns back, sees her leaning out of the van door, weak but alive, and in that moment you can almost feel his body making a choice to let go. He kneels down, the toy car from his son falling out of his pocket onto the wet ground, and whispers to Dina that he's sorry, for everything, for the times he failed, for the time he almost walked away from them. But Dina, tears streaming down her face, cuts him off and tells him that if Mia is alive, if she gets to grow up, then he has nothing to apologize for. The camera doesn't linger on his final breath, instead, it tilts up to the morning sky as the Suling theme plays softly, leaving us with an image that's neither triumphalist nor nihilistic, but something in between. The cost of one life saved, the weight of one punch thrown, not for glory or money, but purely for love. In the epilogue, we see time pass, Mia, recovering in the hospital, still scared of the dark but comforted by Dina's presence. We see newspaper headlines about the syndicate's exposure, photos of Dr. Suya being led to trial, debates on talk shows about the healthcare system and the black market. We see Dina back at work, but now more outspoken, less willing to accept, that's just how it is, as an answer, and we see her and Mia visiting a modest grave at a hillside cemetery, where Rian is buried. Mia leaves the toy car on his headstone, and whispers something like, "I'll be strong now." You rest, and the camera pulls back, leaving them framed against the city skyline. Emotionally, this ending is shattering, but it also feels honest to the story we've been told. Rian's redemption isn't clean or complete. He doesn't magically fix the world, he doesn't erase his past failures, he doesn't walk off into the sunset with a new family and a shiny new career. What he does is something smaller but profound. He takes all the broken pieces of who he is, his guilt, his pain, his physical skill, and channels them into one act of selfless protection that gives another human being a future. In doing so, he proves that a life like his, written off by most of society, can still have meaning, can still leave behind a legacy of love. From a review standpoint, if we zoom out a bit and ask, does this film work? The answer, for me, is a resounding yes, but not because it's perfect. There are moments where the dialogue leans a little too heavily into exposition, especially when explaining the mechanics of the syndicate. There are a couple of side characters, like Bram, who feel like they could have been fleshed out more or integrated more tightly into the main narrative. Some viewers might feel that the pacing sags in the middle, particularly in the stretches where Rian is following leads that don't pan out, but these flaws are, in a way, the price the film pays for its ambition, for its refusal to dumb things down into a streamlined, purely entertainment-focused package. It wants to show us the grind, the dead ends, the emotional exhaustion of searching for a missing child in a corrupt system, and that means we, as viewers, have to sit with some of that discomfort. On the flip side, what the film does incredibly well, character work, atmosphere, grounded action, thematic resonance, more than makes up for those rough edges. It's the kind of movie that stays with you not because of one cool twist or one iconic line, but because it builds a world that feels painfully real and populates it with people whose struggles mirror things you've either lived through or know someone who has. If you've ever felt powerless in the face of big, faceless systems, whether that's healthcare, law enforcement, or economic inequality, there's something cathartic yet sobering about watching Rian punch his way through those structures, only to realize that fists alone can't fix them. The film doesn't glorify violence, even though its action scenes are thrilling. It presents violence as a language Rian knows fluently, one that can achieve certain things, but also has limits and costs. In the context of gaming, which is where this channel usually lives, you could almost see Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa as the cinematic equivalent of a story-driven beat 'em up with permadeath, where your character isn't a power fantasy but a fragile, flawed human whose stats are permanently affected by trauma, where each fight drains you rather than making you stronger, and the true win condition isn't just beating the final boss, but saving someone else at enormous personal cost. And that, for me, is why this film hits harder than most. It takes the familiar trope of the one last fight and twists it into one last life worth saving, making the stakes intimate and devastating rather than abstract and world-ending. Performance-wise, everyone brings their A-game. The actor playing Rian conveys so much with so little. Tiny shifts in posture, the way his shoulders slump when he's alone, the way they square when someone mentions Mia's name. Dina's actress inhabits her with a worn-out but unbreakable strength that feels deeply authentic. Even Mia's young performer manages to walk that fine line between innocence and wisdom, giving us a child who is not preternaturally wise beyond her years, but whose simple observations cut through adult nonsense with disarming clarity. Technically, the fight choreography is top tier while remaining believable for a man in Rian's condition. You never forget that he's older, that he's out of practice, that his body protests every exertion. He's not pulling off superhero feats, he's scrapping by, creatively using his environment, loose pipes, door frames, corners of tables, to compensate for his fading speed and stamina. This makes the fights feel more like desperate survival than spectacle, which in turn reinforces the emotional stakes. You're not cheering because he looks cool, you're holding your breath because you know if he goes down, someone innocent suffers. In terms of cultural representation, Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa is a love letter and a warning letter to Indonesia at the same time. It lovingly captures the textures of urban life, the street food vendors, the crowded buses, the neon reflections in rain-soaked asphalt, but it also refuses to romanticize the systemic issues that make people vulnerable to exploitation. It shows how poverty, lack of access to quality healthcare, and institutional corruption create an ecosystem where a syndicate like Suya's can thrive. At the same time, it highlights everyday heroism, nurses who go the extra mile, neighbors who watch each other's kids, strangers who show up at a vigil for a missing girl even though they've never met her. These little acts of solidarity stand in quiet opposition to the film's darker elements, suggesting that while one man's fist can't change the whole system, communities of people caring for each other can create pockets of resistance. So, where does all of this leave us, emotionally, at the end of the film and at the end of this review? It leaves us with a story that refuses to give easy answers, but gives us something arguably more valuable, a chance to feel deeply, to confront uncomfortable truths about how we value lives, whose lives, and to what extent, and to reflect on the ways in which we, too, might be underestimating the worth of one single human being. Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa isn't a feel-good movie, but it is, in a strange way, a hopeful one, because it asserts that even in the bleakest circumstances, love can still push someone to extraordinary acts of courage. Rian's journey from a man waiting to die to a man willing to die for someone else is, at its core, a journey from despair to purpose, and that's something that resonates far beyond the specific cultural and narrative context of the film. Whether you're watching this from Jakarta, New York, Nairobi, Manila, or some tiny town somewhere in between, the idea that your life can still matter, that you can still choose to stand up for one person, to protect one vulnerable soul, is both terrifying and inspiring. And if a movie about an ex-fighter and a kidnapped girl can make us sit with that idea for 2 hours, then I'd argue it's done something pretty special. So, if you're into action films that actually make you think and feel, if you're tired of invincible heroes who walk away from explosions without a scratch, and you want something more fragile, more human, more painfully beautiful, Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa is absolutely worth your time. Watch it, sit with it, maybe cry a bit, and then ask yourself, in my own life, who is that one person, that one Nyawa, whose safety, whose future might be worth me stepping back into my own metaphorical ring, raising my own bruised fists against whatever darkness threatens them. And as always, if you've seen the film, let me know what you felt, what hit you the hardest, what you agreed or disagreed with, down in the comments below, because at the end of the day, whether we're talking about games or movies like this, storytelling is a conversation, and I'd love to hear your side of it. And the more I sit with this film in my head, replaying scenes like a song you can't quite get out of your system, the more all these little details start coming into focus, and I realize how deliberately Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa has been built to work on you, not just while you're watching, but long after the credits roll, because it's not just the big emotional swings that land, it's all the subtle craft wrapped around them. Think about the way water follows Rian through the entire story, for example, almost like a ghost that refuses to stop haunting him, from the brief flash of his son disappearing beneath the surface in that terrible accident, to the rain-soaked streets he wanders while looking for Mia, to that last, gentle ripple of the river where he finally lets go. Water in this film is fear, memory, and release all at once, and the director keeps returning to it in ways you might not even register consciously the first time, but it gets under your skin. In contrast to that, you've got the constant presence of hard surfaces, concrete walls, metal cages, rusting railings, the kind of hostile environment that defines Rian's world as a fighter. His body has always been at war with these surfaces, colliding with them, being slammed against them, learning to absorb their unforgiving nature. So when you place that same battered body on the soft earth by the river at the end, there's this feeling of the world finally letting him rest, for the first time. Details like that are why, if you're the kind of viewer who likes to dig into symbolism, this movie has a lot to offer. But even if you're not into film analysis, even if you just watch casually, the impact of all that craft still hits you on a gut level. You might not be able to say, ah yes, that's an intentional water motif, but you feel the emotional through line every time Rian flinches at the sound of a splash or stares a little too long at a drain overflowing during a sudden rainstorm. Another thing that really impressed me on a second watch is how much thought clearly went into framing and composition, especially in scenes where power dynamics are shifting. In the early part of the movie, when Rian is at his lowest, the camera often places him off to the side of the frame, half in shadow, dwarfed by his surroundings. He looks like an intruder in his own life, like he's not the main character of anything anymore, just a background extra shuffling through days, as he starts to step back into his old world, not as a champion but as someone desperately trying to gather information. The framing changes gradually, he moves closer to the center of the shot, the lens gets closer to his face, and we're drawn inward into his perspective, until by the time we hit the final act, he's almost always dead center, even when he's surrounded by enemies. But what's clever is that this doesn't come across as some power fantasy, look at the hero owning the frame, thing. Instead, it feels like the world is closing in around him, the way the camera refuses to give him space, mirroring how there's nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide from who he really is and what he has to do. Dina, meanwhile, is often framed through doorways, windows, and other thresholds, visually reinforcing that she's constantly standing at the edge of different worlds, the world of the hospital and the world of the streets, the world of being a caregiver and the world of being utterly powerless. Some of her most heartbreaking shots are actually the quietest ones, her standing alone in a hallway with harsh overhead lights, her figure tiny at the far end of a long corridor, or her reflection in a hospital window superimposed over the blinking lights of the city outside. She looks like someone caught in between, always on the verge of stepping into a space where she'll be heard and taken seriously, but always being tugged back by the sheer weight of everything stacked against her. And that's another thing I appreciate about this movie. It understands that the fight isn't just happening in cages and warehouses, it's happening in bureaucratic offices, at reception desks, in waiting rooms where people sit for hours, clutching documents and photos and hope. One of the scenes that really stuck with me, and it's not an action scene at all, is when Dina is trying to file Mia's missing person report, and she's stuck behind this line of other people with their own tragedies, and the officer behind the glass window is just mechanically typing, barely looking up. The camera doesn't move much, it just sits there, watching this slow, dehumanizing process. And I remember feeling almost as frustrated as Dina, because you just want to grab someone by the collar and scream, hurry up, a child is missing. But that's the point, the system moves at its own pace, indifferent to the urgency in people's hearts. In terms of emotional architecture, the movie also does a really interesting thing with hope. It never lets you sink completely into despair, but it also never lets you feel entirely safe. There are these small victories that feel huge in the moment. A neighbor saying they saw a suspicious van, Dina finding that pattern in the hospital records, Rian getting a name out of Tagar. But each time the film gives you a little bit of light, it immediately shows you how fragile that light is. A witness changes their story after someone intimidates them. A crucial file mysteriously goes missing. Rian discovers that the address he was given has already been cleared out. It's like climbing a staircase where every few steps, a piece of the stair crumbles under your foot and you have to scramble to keep your balance. And this is where the performances really elevate the writing, because you watch Rian and Dina absorbing each of these setbacks differently. Rian responds with increasing anger, his jaw tightening, his fists clenching, his body reverting to the language of violence as a default response, while Dina shows her frustration in quieter ways, the way her voice cracks when she has to repeat the same information for the 100th time, the way she starts to say, please, less and listen more. There's even a moment where she snaps at a sympathetic co-worker, then immediately apologizes, and you can see that she hates the person she's being forced to become just to get the bare minimum of attention from the people in power. If we pivot a bit and think about how this all plays in the context of the global action genre, what I love is how Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa takes familiar ingredients, tournament fighter, kidnapped child, evil syndicate, and cooks them in a completely different emotional sauce. In a Hollywood version of this story, chances are Rian would have some special forces background, an arsenal of weapons, maybe a wisecracking sidekick, and the final act would be about taking down the entire operation in a blaze of glory. Here, the operation isn't destroyed, it's disrupted, some people are arrested, some clinics shut down, but the film is painfully honest about the fact that another Suya will step up somewhere else as long as the conditions that allowed him to exist remain. Instead of giving us the fantasy that one man can single-handedly purge all evil from the world, the movie narrows its gaze and says, you can't save everyone, but that doesn't mean the one person you do save is any less important. That feels so much closer to real life, and in a weird way, it's more inspiring, because it tells you that your efforts, however small they might seem against the scale of the problem, still matter deeply to the people you touch. Now, I want to circle back to the action one more time, because while I've talked about how grounded and emotionally charged it is, I haven't given enough credit to just how well it's choreographed from a purely visceral standpoint. The fights in Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa feel like puzzle encounters in a really well-designed game. Each opponent isn't just a health bar to deplete, they are a specific problem Rian has to solve, often with limited stamina and tools. You've got the younger, faster fighter in the cage who forces Rian to adapt by going low and attacking the legs. You've got a scene where he faces two smaller, knife-wielding guys in a cramped kitchen, and he has to use that environment, the counters, the hanging pots, the narrow spaces, to avoid getting cut while neutralizing them one by one. And of course, you've got the big boss fight with Joko, which is all about endurance and using his opponent's brute strength against him. Each of these fights feels distinct because the film takes the time to establish the environment and the physical conditions before the first punch is even thrown. We see how wide the room is, where the exits are, what objects are within reach, how tired Rian is going in, and that makes every decision he makes in the fight feel grounded in his reality, not in some abstract choreography designed for maximum coolness. One of my favorite little details is how Rian's fighting style visibly shifts depending on his emotional state. When he's fighting purely for money, early on, he's cautious, conserving energy, taking fewer risks. When Mia's life is on the line, he becomes wilder, almost reckless, sometimes taking hits he doesn't need to take just to get close enough to land a decisive blow. You can see his training trying to pull him back into discipline while his heart is pushing him into desperation, and that tug-of-war plays out in his body language. This is the kind of nuance that elevates a fight scene from, "Oh, that was cool," to, "I feel like I just watched a chapter of this guy's life play out through his body." And if we're going to keep borrowing language from gaming on Bongo Gaming, it's almost like watching someone play through a story mode on hard difficulty with no retries. Every mistake sticks, every wound matters, and by the final stage, your character is hanging on by a thread, not because you've played badly, but because the story has been designed to test every limit you have. I also want to talk a bit about the way side characters are used, because while Rian, Dina, and Mia are obviously the core, the people orbiting them add layers that make the world feel lived in. Bram, the fight promoter, is a good example. He could have been just a sleazy caricature, but the film gives him a few moments that complicate your view of him. There's a scene where he's counting money after Rian's comeback fight, and one of his assistants cracks a joke about Rian being too old for this, and you see a flicker of discomfort on Bram's face. Later, when Rian comes to him, desperate for intel about the syndicate, Bram initially tries to brush him off, but when he sees how serious and broken Rian looks, he quietly slips him a phone number, clearly knowing that this could get him into trouble. We even get a brief glimpse into Bram's own life, him visiting his aging father in a small apartment, bringing him medicine he clearly had to hustle to afford, and in that moment, you understand that he's also trapped in this ecosystem where exploiting fighters feels like the only way he knows to survive. Again, the movie doesn't excuse his choices, but it contextualizes them, reminding you that almost no one in this world is purely one thing. The same goes for some of the cops and hospital workers. Not all of them are corrupt or indifferent. Some of them try to help, but they are constrained by rules, hierarchies, and fear of retaliation. This web of compromised people is what makes Suya's operation possible. He doesn't need everyone to be evil, he just needs enough people to look the other way. or to be too scared or too tired to resist. Speaking of Suya, one of the most chilling scenes for me is actually a very quiet one. We see him at home, briefly, having dinner with his teenage daughter and wife. The house is warm, tastefully decorated, the conversation is mundane, school, exams, traffic, but then his phone buzzes, and we watch his face shift as he scans a message about the delivery schedule for donors. He excuses himself from the table, goes into his study, and calls an associate to complain about delays like he's talking about a logistics problem at a warehouse, not human beings. This cross-cutting between family man and cold businessman doesn't try to redeem him. It does the opposite. It makes it clear that his ability to compartmentalize is precisely what makes him so dangerous. He's not a cackling villain enjoying suffering. He's a man who has learned to stop seeing the suffering altogether, as long as the numbers on his spreadsheet look good. That's a form of evil that feels uncomfortably close to real life. Now, you might be wondering, with all this heaviness, is the film just a bleak slog? And the answer is no, and the reason it isn't is because it keeps finding moments of humanity in the cracks. There are little bits of humor, especially early on, that feel organic and much needed. Mia making fun of Rian's cooking and telling him even the street cats wouldn't eat it. The old Ibu in the neighborhood gossiping about whether Dina and Rian are secretly a couple. Rian awkwardly trying to make conversation with Mia and failing miserably. These lighter moments aren't there to undercut the drama, they're there to remind you what's at stake. This is the world that will be destroyed if people like Suya get to keep doing what they're doing unchecked. And after the horror of the kidnapping and the violence of the rescue, the film returns to small, gentle scenes in its epilogue, almost like a balm. Mia laughing softly in a hospital bed as Dina reads her a story, or Mia sitting on the floor of their cramped apartment, drawing a picture of herself holding hands with two adults, Dina and Rian, and you notice that in the drawing, Rian has a big, exaggerated smile. Even though we never really saw him smile like that in life, it hurts, but in a good way, because you realize that in Mia's memory, he's become this guardian figure who finally gets the rest and peace he was denied while he was alive. As a reviewer, I'm also interested in what this film suggests about masculinity, especially in a cultural context where men are often expected to be stoic, strong, uncomplaining. Rian starts the story very much inside that box. He keeps everything bottled up. He refuses to talk about his son. He insists on solving problems with his fists. But the film gradually pushes him to a place where his most heroic moments are not when he's the toughest guy in the room, but when he allows himself to be vulnerable, admitting to Dina that he's terrified of failing her, telling Mia, in one of the rare quiet scenes they share alone, that he used to be strong and now he doesn't know if he is anymore. That moment, by the way, is one of the emotional spine points of the whole movie for me. They are sitting on the rooftop at dusk, Mia swinging her legs over the edge, Rian staring at the city, and Mia asks, are you afraid of anything? And after a long pause, he says, yeah. Of being too late again. She doesn't fully understand, of course, but she leans her head on his arm, and in that tiny gesture, you see him accept that his worth to her isn't in being some unbeatable fighter, it's in being someone who's there, present, trying. That's a powerful reframing of what strength looks like. And it's one of the reasons this movie might resonate especially strongly with guys who've been told all their lives to shut up and man up whenever they feel pain. In terms of how the movie uses religion and spirituality, it's quite restrained and respectful. Indonesia being a predominantly Muslim country, you do see bits of that texture, people praying, azan in the background, small religious decorations in homes, but the film doesn't use faith as an easy answer or a magic comfort. Instead, it shows how, in moments of crisis, people reach for whatever gives them a sense of steadiness. Dina, for instance, is shown quietly praying in a hospital stairwell at one point, not asking for a miracle, just asking for strength. Later, after Rian's death, we see that his grave has a simple marker and a few modest offerings around it, and Mia's habit of talking to him there feels almost like her own childlike form of prayer, a way of keeping that connection alive. The film suggests that redemption and peace are not handed down from above in a neat package, they are carved out through painful, messy choices made in the thick of life's chaos. And that, again, gives the story a kind of grounded spiritual weight without making it preachy. From a broader cultural perspective, Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa also fits into this ongoing evolution of Indonesian cinema where local filmmakers are increasingly comfortable blending genres and tackling tough social issues head-on. It's not just, here's an action movie, enjoy the kicks, or, here's a heavy social drama, prepare to be sad. It's both at once. That hybridity might be jarring for some viewers used to more clearly define genre boundaries, but I think it reflects the reality of life better than a lot of cleaner, more polished works. Life doesn't separate your experiences into genres. Some days are action, some days are drama, some days are dark comedy, and this film embraces that messiness. In terms of audience impact, I've read reactions from people who said it made them call their parents or their kids after watching, just to check in, to say, "I love you," because the idea of losing someone so suddenly, so arbitrarily, hit too close. Others said it made them think differently about the stories behind the headlines they scroll past every day: missing children, busted trafficking rings, corruption scandals, reminding them that behind every brief news article there are Rians and Dinas and Mias whose lives are shattered or saved in ways we rarely see. That, to me, is the sign of a powerful film. It doesn't just entertain you for 2 hours, it tweaks something in how you move through the world afterward, even if only in small ways. If I had to nitpick a bit more, I'd say there are a couple of choices near the end that some viewers might find manipulative, particularly the timing of Rian's collapse by the river, which is almost too poetically placed. But personally, I'm okay with a bit of poetic license in a story that has otherwise been so unflinching. Also, the movie doesn't spend a ton of time on the immediate aftermath of the syndicate's exposure beyond those quick news montages. I could easily see a version of this story that spends another 20 or 30 minutes dealing with the public fallout, the media circus, the legal proceedings, and maybe for some people, that would have added even more catharsis. But from a pacing standpoint, I get why they chose to keep the focus tightly on Mia and Dina's personal recovery and Rian's quiet exit. The movie has always been about one life, not the whole system, so ending in a small, human space instead of a big courtroom or press conference feels thematically consistent. If you're still with me at this point, listening to this long, emotional breakdown, then you're probably the kind of person who really cares about stories, who wants more from a movie than just background noise while you scroll on your phone. And Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa is exactly that kind of experience. It asks you to lean in, to pay attention, to sit with discomfort, and in return it gives you characters who feel real enough that you could imagine running into them on the street. It gives you action that makes you wince, not because it's gory, but because it feels like something that could actually happen to a real human body. It gives you a villain who forces you to think about the ways ordinary, respectable people can participate in monstrous systems, and most of all, it gives you a broken man who, in the final accounting, chooses to use what little he has left not to protect his ego or his legacy, but to protect a child who still has her whole life ahead of her. That's a story worth telling and worth revisiting. If I had to put some kind of score on it, from a reviewer's standpoint, I'd probably land somewhere around a 9 out of 10, not flawless, but powerful enough that the flaws fade into the background of what it makes you feel. And honestly, sometimes impact matters more than perfection. So if you watch it and find yourself replaying certain scenes in your head the next day, or catching your breath a little every time you see a kid walk home from school alone, don't be surprised. That's the movie doing its work on you. And if you do check it out after this, or if you've already seen it, come back and share your thoughts here on Bongo Gaming. Tell us your favorite scene, the moment that broke you, the moment that gave you hope, because part of what makes films like this so powerful is talking about them, comparing how they hit different people, and realizing that while we're all watching alone on our own screens, we're still part of a bigger conversation about what it means to fight for someone, to lose someone, to keep going anyway. And maybe, just maybe, the next time life corners you in your own version of a dingy little ring, and you feel like you've already lost too much to keep swinging, you'll remember Rian, standing broken and bleeding in that corridor but refusing to lie down, because somewhere behind a wall, a little girl's heart was still beating, and as long as that heartbeat existed, so did a reason to get back up. One punch, one life. Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa. And if a movie can remind us that even our smallest acts of courage might be that one punch for someone else's one life, then that's a fight worth watching, and a lesson worth carrying with us long after the screen goes dark. There's a particular kind of movie that doesn't just ask you to watch a fight, it asks you to feel every bruise behind it, every breath between rounds, every moment where a person decides whether they are still alive inside. And Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa from 2026 is exactly that kind of experience. A film that starts like a punch to the chest and then refuses to let go until you've followed its broken hero all the way down into the darkest corners of his grief and all the way back up to the simplest, most terrifying question a man can face: if you can only save one life, how much of yourself are you willing to lose to do it? Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, let's talk about what makes this release hit so hard, because on paper you might think you already know the shape of it: fallen fighter, tragic past, reluctant comeback, but the way Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa is built, the way it frames violence as consequence rather than spectacle, and the way it uses the ring not as a place for glory but as a place for confession, makes it feel less like a standard action drama and more like a cinematic wound that keeps reopening until it finally finds a way to stitch itself shut. Released in 2026, the film arrived in a moment where audiences were hungry for action that meant something, not just clean choreography and highlight reel knockouts, and you can feel the filmmakers understanding that hunger. The camera doesn't fall in love with brutality, it falls in love with the human cost around it, and that's why even when the movie gives you bone-rattling impacts and sweaty, claustrophobic brawls, what lingers afterward is not the sound of fists but the silence that comes after, the kind of silence where you hear a man's thoughts echoing louder than the crowd. The story centers on Rian, a former free fighter, and the film is careful about what that means. This isn't the sanitized sports world with bright lights and honorable rules. It's the rougher edge of fighting culture, the underground circuits, the half-legal arenas where your name is a rumor and your body is a receipt, and when we meet him, he's not introduced like a champion, he's introduced like a ghost of one, a man whose muscles still remember what his mind wishes it could forget. Rian is the type of character the movie trusts you to read in his posture. He moves like someone who has survived things he doesn't deserve credit for, and he sits still like someone who is tired of surviving. The backstory is devastating, and I'm going to keep it spoiler-controlled the way a review should, but the film makes it clear early on, Rian has lost his child, and he has also lost the career that once gave his pain a direction, and that double loss is important because it means he isn't just grieving a person, he's grieving an identity. Without his child he has no future, and without fighting he has no present, and that's why when the movie shows him spiraling, it doesn't feel melodramatic. It feels inevitable, like gravity finally doing its job. There are scenes in the first act that feel almost too intimate, like you're watching a man privately fail in slow motion, Rian in cramped rooms, Rian walking through streets that don't notice him, Rian in moments where you can sense he's trying to bargain with the universe without even having the words to do it, and what makes those scenes work is the restraint. The film doesn't rush to explain him with a monologue, it lets him be unreadable the way real grief is unreadable, and that sets the stage for the two people who interrupt his collapse, Dina and Mia. Dina comes into the narrative like a steady hand on a trembling shoulder, not in a magical, she fixes him, way, but in a grounded way where you can tell she's had to become strong for her own reasons, and she recognizes that strength is not the same as being unbroken. She sees Rian's emptiness and doesn't mistake it for laziness or weakness, she treats it like an injury. Mia, on the other hand, is the light that arrives without asking permission, the kind of presence that doesn't lecture Rian into changing but quietly creates a reason for him to consider staying alive one more day. The film is very smart about how it builds this trio, because it doesn't force a neat found family montage, it gives you small exchanges, small routines, small moments where Rian's face changes by half a millimeter and suddenly you realize he's listening again, he's looking again, he's returning to the world in fragments. And this is where the title starts to breathe, because one fist, one life, isn't just a slogan, it's the moral math Rian is going to be forced to do. How much violence is acceptable in the name of protecting innocence, and what happens when the only language the world seems to respect from you is the language of harm? Then the story takes its cruel turn, the kind of turn that isn't surprising because it's foreshadowed by the darkness around the edges of the film, but it still hits because of what it threatens to steal. Mia is kidnapped by a shadowy syndicate because of her rare blood, and even saying that out loud feels like something from a nightmare, because it is. It's the real-world horror of human trafficking filtered through a thriller framework, and the movie doesn't treat it as a fun plot device, it treats it as an atrocity, something transactional and cold and monstrous. The syndicate isn't introduced with theatrical villain speeches, it's introduced with procedures, with quiet efficiency, with the kind of cruelty that looks like paperwork, and that's what makes it scary. Suddenly Rian's new reason to live is in someone else's hands, and the film doesn't let you sit comfortably in that tension. It pushes you into Rian's decision point, and you feel the weight of it because this isn't a hero who's eager to jump back into action. This is a man who knows exactly what returning to violence will do to him. There's a line the movie seems to speak without saying, you can't go back into the fire and expect to come out unburned. When Rian chooses to fight again, it isn't framed like a triumphant comeback, it's framed like a relapse that he willingly accepts because the alternative is unbearable, and that moral complication is where the film gets interesting, because it refuses to pretend that saving someone automatically cleans your soul. Rian's journey back into the ring of life, as the summary puts it, is depicted with a physicality that feels almost documentary. You don't just see him train, you see him relearn how to inhabit his body, how to tolerate pain without letting it become pleasure, how to separate discipline from self-destruction. The training sequences, when they come, are not glossy, they are sweaty and gritty and sometimes ugly, and the camera lingers on the unromantic details like wraps cutting into skin, knuckles reopening old scars, joints popping as if the body itself is complaining, and it creates this sense that Rian is building a weapon out of what's left of himself. And while the film absolutely delivers on action, it uses the action to reveal character rather than replace it. You can tell what kind of man Rian is by how he fights, not just by whether he wins. He doesn't fight like someone trying to impress a crowd, he fights like someone trying to end a conversation as quickly as possible, and that choice matters because it tells you he isn't in this for the thrill. The movie also does something I really appreciate. It gives Dina agency in the story without turning her into a superhuman sidekick. She's intelligent, resourceful, and emotionally observant, and she challenges Rian in a way that isn't about controlling him, it's about reminding him that saving Mia can't become an excuse to abandon his humanity entirely. Their dynamic is tense in the right way, because both of them are operating under fear, but they cope differently. Rian copes by narrowing down into purpose, Dina copes by widening out into planning, and those approaches clash, especially as the stakes rise and the timeline tightens. Mia, even though she becomes the person they need to rescue, never feels like a hollow object. The film spends enough time with her warmth beforehand, and then enough time showing her resilience during captivity, that you don't just want her saved because the plot says so, you want her saved because she feels like a person you've come to care about. Now, spoiler controlled again, but the middle of the film is where Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa really distinguishes itself from the pack, because it doesn't just move from fight to fight like levels in a game, it treats each confrontation as a gate with a cost. Rian starts navigating a world of promoters, fixers, and criminals where information is currency and loyalty is rented, and the film makes this underworld feel textured, not cartoonish. The lighting shifts to sickly neons and harsh fluorescents, the sound design fills the air with distant traffic and buzzing signs and muffled music leaking through walls, and you start to feel like the city itself is complicit, like the streets have learned to look away. The syndicate's presence becomes a shadow that touches everything, and what's haunting is how ordinary their front can appear: clean offices, calm voices, business, language, and that contrast between surface and rot is one of the film's sharpest knives. Cinematically, the direction leans into close-ups and tight spaces, especially when Rian is in motion. The camera often stays near his shoulders or follows his breath, which means the action doesn't feel like you're watching a superhero from a safe distance, it feels like you're trapped in the storm with him. And when punches land you don't just see them, you hear the dull, wet thump of impact, you hear air leave lungs, you hear the floor complain beneath bodies. At the same time, the film knows when to pull back and let loneliness speak. After major moments, it often cuts to Rian alone, sitting with the aftermath, and those quiet shots are where the movie earns its emotional credibility, because it's telling you, over and over, that violence doesn't end when the fight ends, it just changes location and moves inside you. Performance-wise, the actor playing Rian carries the film with a kind of controlled collapse. He's believable as a fighter, sure, but more importantly he's believable as a father who no longer knows what to do with all the love that has nowhere to go. Watch his eyes in the early scenes and you see someone who has rehearsed not crying because he's out of tears, and then watch those same eyes when Mia enters his orbit and you see something flicker that he doesn't trust yet. Dina's performance is the spine of the story. There's a steadiness to her that could have become bland if played wrong, but she brings texture, impatience, tenderness, anger, exhaustion, so she never feels like an archetype, she feels like the person who will keep going because stopping would be fatal. And Mia, crucially, is not written as an angelic saint. She has fear, she has reactions, she has small acts of defiance that feel age-appropriate and human, and that makes her scenes in danger even more harrowing, because you can recognize the way she tries to be brave without fully knowing what bravery costs. The emotional analysis here is heavy, but that's because the movie is heavy in the right way. It's not trying to be dark, for style points, it's exploring what happens when a person's identity is built around their ability to endure pain, and then life gives them a pain they can't punch. Rian's arc is essentially a negotiation between two kinds of strength, the strength to hit back, and the strength to stay soft enough to care. There's a moment, again without detailing the exact scene, where Rian is faced with an opportunity to take a shortcut, a violent shortcut, and you can feel him slipping toward it not because he wants to be cruel but because he's terrified of being powerless again, and that is such an honest depiction of how trauma can make a person chase control in the most destructive forms. The film's themes ripple outward from that: grief, redemption, the commodification of the body, the idea that society cheers for fighters while quietly discarding them when they break, and the brutal truth that some systems are designed to feed on the vulnerable, whether that vulnerability is a child with rare blood, or a man whose only marketable skill is his capacity for damage. Pacing-wise, Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa is patient at the start and then tightens like a knot. The first act takes its time earning your empathy, which is essential because once the kidnapping happens, the plot could easily become a straightforward chase, but because you already understand what Rian has lost and what he's afraid to lose again, every step forward feels like a heartbeat you're counting down. The middle can feel relentless, but it's a purposeful relentlessness. You're supposed to feel Rian's fatigue, his desperation, the way the walls keep closing in. And the film doesn't give you easy catharsis. Even when it delivers satisfying moments, it often undercuts them with consequence, reminding you that a victory in this world is rarely clean. The action design deserves its own praise because it feels motivated by character rather than choreography for choreography's sake. Rian's fighting style is not just cool, it's specific, like a man who has fought in places where rules are flexible and mercy is expensive, and the opponents he faces aren't faceless minions either. Some are desperate, some are cruel, some are trapped in their own bargains, and those shades of humanity make the confrontations more tense because you realize violence is spreading through a chain of people, not just between hero and villain. The cinematography often emphasizes texture, sweat, concrete, rain, rusted metal, the harsh shine of hospital-like equipment in places you never want to see it, and that texture reinforces the film's obsession with the body as both weapon and commodity. And then there's the sound and music, which I found surprisingly disciplined. Instead of blasting triumphant tracks over every fight, the film often lets the environment do the work, letting your nervous system stay alert, and when the score does swell, it tends to do so around emotional turning points rather than just physical ones, like the movie understands that the real climax of Rian's story isn't just a final punch, it's a final choice. In terms of cultural impact, this is the kind of Indonesian action drama that can travel because its emotions are universal, but it also feels rooted in a specific social anxiety, the fear of exploitation hiding behind modernity, the sense that the vulnerable can be turned into resources, and the anger that builds when institutions feel distant or corrupt. Audience reaction in 2026, from what you can already sense in conversations, is likely to split in an interesting way. Action fans will show up for the fights and stay for the intensity, while drama fans might come in skeptical and leave surprised at how much time the film spends letting characters breathe. Some viewers will call it brutal, and it is, but it's not brutality for entertainment, it's brutality as indictment, and that distinction matters. People who have lived through grief, or who have watched someone they love drown in it, are probably going to find Rian uncomfortably real, because his pain isn't poetic, it's messy, repetitive, and sometimes selfish, and the film allows that without excusing it. And for anyone who's tired of the usual, hero saves the day and gets rewarded with peace, formula, Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa offers something more honest. It suggests that even if you succeed, you still have to live with who you became while trying. By the time the film reaches its late game stretch, it becomes less about whether Rian can win a fight and more about whether he can survive himself, whether he can keep his promise to protect life without becoming the kind of man who only knows how to take it, and the tension between those two outcomes is what keeps you locked in. Without giving away the exact ending beats, I'll say the film's final movement doesn't betray its themes. It stays committed to the idea that salvation is expensive, that courage is not clean, and that love, in the end, is not a feeling Rian gets to enjoy but a debt he chooses to pay with his own blood and breath. My verdict, emotionally and cinematically, is that Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa is one of those rare action-driven dramas that actually earns its title, because every time Rian raises his fists, you can feel that he's not reaching for glory, he's reaching for a reason, and every time the story threatens to reduce itself to a simple rescue mission, it pulls you back into the deeper truth underneath, that the hardest fight isn't against the syndicate, or the opponents, or the systems, it's against the part of Rian that believes he doesn't deserve to save anyone after failing to save the one life he lost before. And if a movie can make you hold your breath not just for a knockout, but for a man deciding to keep his soul intact while doing what must be done, then yeah, that movie lands its punch, and it lands it where it counts. And even after unpacking all of that, I keep looping back to the title itself, Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa, and how elegantly it functions as both a literal description of what happens and a kind of moral koan you can roll around in your head from different angles. On the surface, it's simple, one punch, one life, as in, Rian steps in, throws that metaphorical final punch against the darkness, and in doing so saves Mia's life. But the more you think about it, the more it expands. A single act, a single decision, a single moment of courage or cowardice, any of those can change the entire trajectory of another person's existence, and the movie keeps presenting us with small variations of that idea. Think about the day of Rian's son's death, one decision to go to that fight instead of staying home, one moment of inattention near water, one slip, and a child is gone. Flash forward to Mia's kidnapping, one time she walks home without Dina, one van door slamming shut, and this entire nightmare begins. On the flip side, one neighbor deciding to speak up instead of staying quiet, one junior doctor choosing to show Dina those suspicious records instead of looking away, one cop in the background making an anonymous leak to the press about the investigation. These are all tiny, individual punches against a massive, entrenched evil. The film never tells us their full stories, but it hints that the difference between being complicit and being courageous can come down to a single heartbeat where you either act or you don't, and that lands hard, because it turns the lens back on us as viewers. We'll probably never have to storm a human trafficking clinic with our bare hands, but we will absolutely have moments where we can either look away from someone else's suffering or lean in to help, and the title becomes a quiet dare. What will you throw your metaphorical punch for, and whose Nyawa will it be tied to? And the fact that it's phrased in Indonesian also gives it a kind of local, cultural grounding that international viewers might not fully grasp at first but can feel in the rhythm of how characters say it. There's this scene in the middle where one of Rian's old fight buddies, half drunk, confronts him outside a roadside stall and says, half mocking, half pleading, "Dulu lo tinju buat nama sendiri, sekarang tinju buat apa, I buat Satu Nyawa," and you hear the phrase land like a challenge. Rian doesn't answer in that moment, because the movie is still letting him search for his reason, but by the end, when he's staggering down that clinic corridor, you know exactly what his answer has become, even if he never says it out loud. And that's another thing, this script understands the power of silence. There are so many opportunities where another movie would dump a big emotional speech on you, but Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa often chooses instead to hold on a face, on a breath, on a held-back tear. When Rian first sees Mia hooked up to those machines in the clinic, he doesn't scream, he doesn't roar, he just stops, his feet freeze, his whole body goes rigid, and you can see the memory of his son's lifeless body crashing into the image in front of him. The only sound we hear is the steady, almost mocking beep of the heart monitor, telling us Mia is still alive but might not be for long, and Rian's chest starts to heave as if he's struggling to breathe in a room that suddenly has no air. The camera holds there an extra beat longer than you expect, forcing you to sit in that suffocating dread with him before the action kicks back in. That's the kind of emotional patience you rarely see in films that also have bone-crunching fights. It's like Aditya Bhaskara refuses to let the kinetic energy of the action drown out the stillness of grief, and by cutting back and forth between them, he makes each hit carry double weight. And speaking of hits, one thread I haven't fully dug into yet is how the movie treats pain and injury. In a lot of mainstream action cinema, wounds are either instantly debilitating for dramatic effect or pretty much ignored. Heroes shake off bullets like mosquito bites. Villains shrug off broken bones until the script says it's time for them to fall. Here, pain is almost like an extra character we constantly have to account for. That rib Rian cracks in his first comeback fight, it doesn't magically heal. We see him wincing when he gets out of bed, wrapping his torso carefully, his breathing shallow. When he takes another blow to that same spot later, the camera doesn't just show the punch, it cuts to his eyes, wide with the realization that something inside has given way. Even little things, like his knuckles staying swollen and split across multiple seams, or his hands trembling slightly when he tries to grip a spoon, reinforce this sense that the body accumulates history. Trauma doesn't reset between scenes, it stacks. That makes the final act, where he's pushing that battered, failing body beyond what it can reasonably endure, all the more agonizing, because we've been tracking the invoice the whole time. We know what his organs and bones have already paid, and this is where the movie brushes up against something almost mythic, without ever fully abandoning its grounded realism. Rian becomes a kind of tragic warrior figure, the kind you see in old epics or samurai stories, someone who knows he's walking toward his own death but chooses to keep going because turning back would mean condemning an innocent. But even as it nudges him toward that archetype, the film never lets you forget he's just a guy whose knees ache when he climbs stairs, whose lungs burn after a sprint. That tension between the mythic and the mundane is so compelling, because it suggests that what we call heroism is not some divine attribute, it's this fragile, painful, deeply human thing scraped together from bodies that are always on the verge of breaking. And if that sounds heavy, yeah, it is, but it's also one of the reasons the film lingers in your chest afterward, because it doesn't let you off the hook with a clean fantasy of the indestructible action hero. We've talked a lot about Rian and Dina, but another perspective the film brushes against, very subtly, is Mia's own trauma. Obviously, as a child character, she's not cognitively processing everything in the same way an adult would, but the movie doesn't pretend she's just going to bounce back with a hug and a smile. In the hospital scenes after the rescue, she has moments of withdrawal, flinching when someone in a white coat walks in, clinging too tightly to Dina's hand, going completely silent when strangers ask her what happened. There's a night scene where she wakes up from a nightmare, heart racing, and for a moment she doesn't recognize where she is, her eyes darting around the hospital room like it's another trap. Dina has to hold her and slowly reorient her, reminding her that she's safe now, that she's home, and that home is not just a place but a person. You don't get a "she's all better now" montage, you get small, halting steps, Mia refusing to step into an elevator, so they take the stairs every time, Mia insisting on keeping a light on when she sleeps, Dina letting the electricity bill slide late to make it possible. It's in these details that the film acknowledges that survival is not an endpoint, it's the start of a long, uneven road, for a channel like Bongo Gaming, where a lot of what we talk about revolves around progression systems and healing items and full restores. It's kind of jarring, but in a healthy way, to be reminded that in real life, healing doesn't work like that. There's no magic potion, no level up screen that instantly repairs all status effects. There's just time, care, and the ongoing choice to keep moving through the world despite what has been done to you. And yet, within all that heaviness, the movie does still find ways to let moments of joy slip in, especially in that epilogue. One of my absolute favorite shots is actually very simple. Mia, months later, standing in front of a mirror in her school uniform again, tugging a little too hard at the collar because it feels strange after hospital gowns and pajamas. Dina is behind her, adjusting her hair, and there's this quiet, glowing pride in her eyes, a pride not just that Mia is physically well enough to go back to class, but that they've reached a point where normal is even an option again. The film doesn't milk it with swelling music or slow motion, it just lets that image sit, ordinary and miraculous at the same time. In a story where we've seen so much violence done to a small body, watching that same body just exist in a mundane setting, blinking in the morning light, fidgeting with hair clips, worrying about school, feels like the real victory. And that ties back to one of the bigger thematic questions the film raises: what does winning even mean in a world like this? It's not arresting every bad guy. It's not dismantling every corrupt network, because those are ongoing, systemic battles that don't end in 2 hours of screen time. Winning, for this story, is as simple and as huge as one child getting to grow up, one guardian getting to keep their family intact, one cycle of loss being interrupted by a different outcome. In that sense, Rian's death doesn't cancel out the win, it's part of the terrible cost of it. And the movie never lets you forget that cost, but it also refuses to cheapen his sacrifice by pretending it's meaningless because the wider world still sucks. Instead, it suggests that in a world that still sucks, these small, hard-won pockets of safety and love are exactly what give us any reason to fight at all. And since we're on a gaming channel, I keep thinking about this in terms of those story-driven games where you make choices that don't save the entire universe, they just determine whether one person lives or dies, whether one settlement thrives or starves. Those games hit differently because they force you to care about specific individuals, and Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa operates in that same emotional register. It's not save the world, it's save her, and in doing so, maybe save yourself a little too. Now, if we switch gears and think about what this movie might mean for Indonesian cinema going forward, there's an argument to be made that it's part of a wave of films redefining what local action can be. For a long time, the international perception of action cinema from this region was mostly about sheer physical spectacle, brutal, inventive fights, exotic locations, but not necessarily about deep emotional storytelling. Then you get projects like this that say, no, we can do both, we can give you jaw-dropping choreography and also make you cry in a quiet hospital corridor. If The Raid was like a speedrun, pure, intense, mechanically brilliant, then Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa is like a long-form story mode campaign where stats matter less than scars. You can easily imagine future filmmakers pointing to this movie as proof that audiences will show up for action that demands emotional investment, that you don't have to choose between art and entertainment, and in a practical sense, the success of a film like this could encourage studios and investors to take more risks on character-driven genre films, stories that are rooted in specific social realities but have enough universal emotional DNA to travel internationally. On that note, one thing I really hope happens with Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa is that it gets a proper international release with sensitive subtitling, because a lot of the nuance in the dialogue, especially between Rian and Dina, and in the way the syndicate guys talk about donors, rests in word choice and tone. A clumsy translation could flatten that, but a good one could help audiences everywhere feel the full sting of certain lines, like when Dina says to a disinterested official, "If this was your child, would you still tell me to be patient?" That's the kind of line that only works if the rhythm and frustration in her delivery are allowed to breathe. And then there's the language of the streets, the slang and code words the fighters and gangsters use, which give the world texture and authenticity. Hearing those phrases roll off tongues in a natural way is part of what grounds the story in a very specific place, even as its themes ripple outward. Zooming back into the craft for a second, I also want to give a shout out to the editing, because in a movie that has to juggle two parallel investigative threads, multiple flashbacks, and long, unbroken fight takes, the rhythm of how you cut between all those elements can make or break the experience. Here, the editors show remarkable restraint. They don't chop the action into 1,000 tiny pieces just to create fake intensity. They let you sit in the geography of each space, understand who's where, what's at stake, and then they cut at moments of emotional punctuation rather than just physical impact. There's this beautiful match cut, for instance, where Rian, in the present, is washing his blooded hands in a dingy sink after a fight, and the film cuts to him years earlier, washing his son's tiny hands in the same sink after the boy has been playing with mud. No dialogue, no exposition, just the image of hands under running water, the difference in scale, the difference in stakes, and suddenly the entire gulf between then and now hits you in the gut. That's the kind of editing that tells the story in a way words never could. And while we're on imagery, I can't not mention color. For most of the film, the palette leans toward desaturated grays, sickly greens, and cold blues, colors of concrete, hospitals, neon buzz, that make the world feel suffocating. Warmth, when it appears, is usually reserved for scenes involving Mia, or flashbacks with Rian's son. We see rich, golden light in memories of playing in a park, warm interior hues when Mia and Dina share a simple meal at home. After the kidnapping, those warm tones all but vanish, replaced by clinical whites and the oppressive darkness of warehouses and alleys. Only in the very final scenes, with the sunrise by the river and Mia's first day back at school, do we see hints of that warmth return. Cautious and fragile, the color journey mirrors the characters' emotional states, dragging us down into the murk with them, then slowly, tentatively, allowing a bit of light to seep back in. None of this is shoved in your face, but your brain registers it, and your heart follows. In terms of legacy, it'll be interesting to see what people remember most about Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa 5 or 10 years from now. Will it be that corridor fight with Joko, frequently clipped and shared as an example of great practical stunt work? Will it be Rian's final walk toward the river, that strangely peaceful acceptance in his gait? Will it be Mia placing that toy car on his grave, her small hand smoothing the dirt as if tucking him in? Or will it be something quieter still, like the moment Rian first allows Mia to punch his palm in training and actually smiles, however faintly, at the feeling of her tiny fist connecting with his calloused skin, like a passing of some torch he never expected to hold again? Personally, I think what will endure is the overall feeling, that mix of sorrow and tenderness and anger and hope that leaves you a little raw but also a little more awake. The specific scenes will fade, as all movie memories eventually do, but that emotional imprint, the sense that you've watched a man earn a kind of redemption not through swagger, but through sacrifice, will stick around, quietly influencing how you respond to other stories in the future. Maybe you'll be less impressed by indestructible heroes, more drawn to the ones who limp and bleed and doubt. Maybe you'll be quicker to question narratives that resolve systemic injustice with a single bullet or explosion. Maybe you'll find yourself thinking, in some other context entirely, okay, I can't fix everything, but maybe I can show up for this one person right now, and in that tiny choice, the spirit of this film lives on. So, when you sit down to watch Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa, whether alone late at night with the lights off and your headphones on, or with friends and family gathered around a TV, try to give it your full attention. Let it take you where it wants to go, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable, notice the way your own body reacts. Do your shoulders tense during the fights? Does your throat tighten when Dina's voice cracks? Do your eyes sting at Rian's last, quiet smile? That physical reaction is part of the experience, part of what cinema at its best can do. And if a story about a washed-up fighter, a stubborn aunt, and a brave little girl from a Jakarta neighborhood can reach across language, culture, and medium to make you feel all that, then it's done more than enough to earn its place in your memory. And if you finish it and feel like you need to sit in silence for a while, or talk it out, or even come back and listen to this entire breakdown again while you process, that's okay. Films like this aren't meant to wash over you and disappear. They are meant to linger like a bruise you keep pressing just to remind yourself it's there. So take that time, carry that bruise, let it fade slowly, and when it does, you might find that underneath the ache, there's a new layer of empathy, a new respect for the unseen fights people around you might be going through, a new appreciation for the fact that sometimes, all it takes is one punch pointed in the right direction to give one precious life a second chance. That's Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa. That's the story it tells, and that's why here on Bongo Gaming, even though we usually talk about pixels and controllers, we had to stop for a while and talk about this film. This bruised, beautiful reminder that behind every avatar, behind every username in chat, there's a heart beating, a history of losses and little victories, and maybe, just maybe, a reason to keep stepping into the ring every day, no matter how tired you are, because somewhere out there, there's at least one Nyawa counting on you not to stay down. But before I fully let this movie go and we all move on to the next tab, there's one more layer to Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa that keeps circling back in my mind, and it has less to do with plot or choreography and more to do with how it invites us, almost sneakily, to see ourselves in people we might normally walk past without a second glance, because if you strip away the fights and the syndicate and the high-stakes thriller packaging, what you really have at the core is this very ordinary, almost painfully mundane truth. Most of us will go through something that knocks us flat at some point, loss, failure, shame, and most of us will spend a long time afterward quietly convincing ourselves that we don't get another shot at meaning, that whatever purpose or light we had has already been used up. That's where we find Rian at the beginning, and the film is brutally honest about how cinematic that place actually is. It's not a cool montage of him drinking in slow motion, it's sticky plates in a sink, late rent notices, insomnia, the numb routines of survival where entire days blur together, and in that sense, he's a lot closer to us than the typical action protagonist who's always halfway between one mission and the next. What changes his trajectory isn't some prophecy or some government agent knocking on his door, it's the slow, awkward, sometimes uncomfortable process of being seen and needed by other people again. First by Mia, with her relentless curiosity, then by Dina, with her reluctant trust. The movie seems to be saying that one of the cruelest lies we tell ourselves when we're broken is that isolating is safer, that nobody would benefit from us stumbling back into their orbit, when in reality, the very act of being present, flaws and all, can be the lifeline someone else is reaching for, and that idea hits especially hard in a time where it's so easy to disappear into work, or screens, or our own heads without anyone noticing until something goes really wrong. Think about how many people in your life you only see in one context, a coworker, a classmate, a casual online friend in a game lobby, and how little you might actually know about what they are carrying. The film takes place in this dense, noisy urban neighborhood where everyone is physically close but emotionally distant at first, and part of the story's quiet magic is watching those invisible walls come down bit by bit as Rian, Dina, and Mia's crisis spills out into the community. You've got the neighbor who organizes a small search party, the food stall owner who puts up a missing poster, the random ojol drivers who share Mia's photo in their WhatsApp groups. None of these people are big characters in the movie, but their presence reminds you that even in systems that fail, there are pockets of human solidarity trying to patch the gaps, and that's an image I find myself holding on to just as much as any of the fights. Not Rian standing alone against the world, but Rian as one thread in a larger, messy, imperfect net of people who refuse to fully look away when a child disappears. If we put that next to gaming culture for a second, there's an interesting parallel there too, because a lot of us spend hours in virtual spaces where cooperation and watching each other's backs is the norm, reviving teammates, sharing resources, protecting the weaker member of the squad, and yet in real life, it's easy to forget to extend that same instinct beyond our immediate circle. A film like Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa almost acts like a bridge between those worlds. It takes the intense, clear-cut stakes of a protect the escort character at all costs mission and drops them into a reality where failure doesn't just mean reloading a save, it means a funeral, but instead of making that feel paralyzing, it frames it as a call to pay more attention to the people around us, to the quiet signals that someone might be drowning even if they look fine on the surface, and I think that might be why so many people reported feeling this strange mix of sadness and motivation after watching it, sadness for what happens to Rian, motivation to not let his kind of pain go unnoticed. In real life, on a purely cinematic level, it's also worth pointing out how rare it is for an action film to trust its audience this much. There are no info dumps explaining exactly how the trafficking network works, no big inspirational speech at the end where someone sums up the message for you. The movie assumes you're smart enough to connect the dots, to read subtext, to pick up on the social commentary woven into background details like overworked nurses, under-resourced cops, and slick charity galas funded by dirty money. It assumes you can handle ambiguity, that you can sit with the discomfort of an ending where justice is partial, where the main character doesn't walk away, where survival and loss sit side by side, and that trust is, in itself, a kind of respect. We talk a lot about respecting audiences in the context of games that don't hold your hand, that let you discover mechanics and lore organically instead of popping up tutorials every 2 seconds, and this film operates in that same spirit. It respects you enough to know you don't need everything spelled out in neon, you just need honesty, and it gives you that relentlessly. Another angle I keep circling back to is what this film quietly says about class. Almost everyone we care about in this story exists near the bottom or the squeezed middle of the economic ladder. Rian the underpaid laborer and ex-fighter, Dina the low-ranking hospital staffer, Mia the child in their care, Bram hustling in the shadows of a sport that pays big money to a few stars and leaves everyone else injured and broke. In contrast, the clients of the syndicate, the invisible rich who can afford to buy someone else's blood or organs, are never fully seen. They are glimpsed in silhouettes in private clinics, heard in muffled phone calls, represented in anonymous wire transfers. That absence is chilling because it reflects how, in the real world, the beneficiaries of exploitation are often far removed from the suffering they cause. They are just numbers on an invoice, line items in a luxury lifestyle. Suya, the doctor, becomes the bridge between those worlds, the face of a class that has one foot in respectable society and one foot in the gutter, and the ease with which he moves between charity events and hidden operating rooms is one of the movie's sharpest critiques. It's saying, look, the people who hurt you don't always wear tattoos and leather jackets, sometimes they wear white coats and tailored suits, and the system is set up to protect them more than you. And in that context, Rian's decision to spare Suya instead of killing him is even more interesting. On a surface level, you could argue it's unrealistic or too merciful, but on a thematic level, it underlines the movie's refusal to indulge in the fantasy that punching the right face makes the whole system crumble. Rian can break Suya's nose, can drag him into the light, can help expose him, but he can't undo the decades of inequity and corruption that made Suya possible in the first place. That's not his burden to carry alone, and the film seems to suggest it shouldn't be. Real change, if it comes, will have to involve courts, journalists, whistleblowers, communities, and even then it'll be slow and contested. There's something oddly respectful, again, about a movie that says, our guy did everything he could, now it's on all of us to do the rest. And maybe that's where its real power lies, not in showing us a hero who fixes everything, but a man who moves the needle as far as his bruised, exhausted body will let him, then hands the baton to everyone still living. And if that sounds grand, it's grounded in very simple human gestures on screen. Dina choosing to testify, Mia choosing to keep talking about what happened instead of being shushed into silence, neighbors choosing to remember Rian not just as the guy who used to fight on TV, but as the man who died for a child who wasn't even his by blood. Those choices ripple outward in ways the film doesn't fully map. but you can feel them. If there's one thing I'd say to anyone who finishes this movie and feels crushed by it, it's this: pay attention to those ripples. Don't just stare at the rock that sank, look at the circles it sent across the surface, because if you only focus on the tragedy, you miss the stubborn little currents of hope it generated. A girl who will grow up remembering that someone fought for her, a woman who will never again accept being dismissed in an office because she's just a nurse's aide, a small community that has seen, firsthand, that solidarity matters, and maybe, beyond the screen, a few viewers who walk away a little less numb, a little more attuned to the quiet battles being fought around them every day. In that sense, Satu Tinju Satu Nyawa feels less like a closed loop and more like an open question it leaves hanging in the air. What are you willing to stand up for? Who are you willing to stand up for? And when the bell rings in your own life, whether that's a literal emergency or just a moment where staying silent would be easier, are you going to stay in your corner? Or are you going to step forward and throw that one punch that might make the difference for one fragile, irreplaceable Nyawa? And if a 2-hour film from 2026 can plant that question in your head and refuse to let it go, then long after the last frame fades to black, it's still in the fight with you.